Hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are joining from. I'm so thrilled to see you all here today. Hi. Just give it a couple more minutes for some people to join in. Hi, Clara. It's so lovely to see so many of you here today. I'm very excited for this talk. This is my first sort of official lecturer as a as an early modernist, so I'm very excited about that. Um, and as you can see, we will be talking about the early modern literary landscape. So, for those that do not know me, hi, my name is Cait. I am a PhD student in early modern literature, focusing primarily on Edmund Spenser and his feminine iconography within his seminal work, The Faerie Queene. But my interest in early modern literature is obviously very expansive. And so I thought that what I would do today is talk through the early modern literary landscape that goes beyond William Shakespeare. As we all are probably well aware, Shakespeare is our most common or most well known um, literary character from the early modern period or the Renaissance period. So, today, what we are going to be focusing on is looking at literary figures and themes and context that extend beyond Shakespeare and beyond what we know about that period of history. The hope is that what we will do is we will open up the lens to wider geographies, genres, and voices, particularly of women writers in the area, as well as any marginalized figures that you may not be aware of, because this area of literature is incredibly rich and filled with some really fantastic figures that we don't seem to know, we don't seem to really hear about that much in the landscape. So feel free while we're going through this to pop questions in the chat. I am very happy to answer as we kind of go along. Um, and hopefully what this will do is just give you an overview that broadens your scope of what this period means and how it actually influenced literature going forward, because it was an incredibly influential period. So let's talk about the broader context of the early modern period. So when we talk about early modern, we are generally talking about the 16th to early 17th century. Some might even say sort of beginning or late 15th century into the 16th century. As always, these kind of time periods are very loosely defined when it comes to this sort of period, but let's say on a rough time around the 16th century. What we are seeing in this space is a whole lot of innovation in things like print culture and literacy. We have got the introduction of the printing press, for instance. This is something that comes through. Let me just, sorry, I've got about 500 tabs open. The printing press comes to England in 1476. But all of a sudden, we've got print culture that is adjusting and is becoming more available to a broader range of people, not just those that have the money to afford print culture. We also have in 1534 the English Reformation that is prompted by Henry VIII and his marriage to Anne Boleyn, where the English church breaks away from the Catholic regime and formulates what is now known as the Church of England. In 1575, we have the rise of pamphlet culture and cheap print, which is being distributed amongst various classes of people, and not just sort of the noblemen and those at court. But speaking of noblemen and those at court, all of a sudden in 1580, we've got the introduction of the Elizabethan court masks and performance. As you may be aware from Shakespeare, Queen Elizabeth I was a mad fan of performances and entertainment. And so she would often have these sort of court performances. Oh, she would have these performers coming to court to perform for her. Contrary to popular belief, Elizabeth actually never went to the Globe Theatre to see any of Shakespeare's plays. That would just not be the done thing. But Shakespeare and his group of players would go to the court to perform parts of his plays to the court and to Elizabeth directly. We've also got quite a bit of political turmoil that is going on in this time. In 1588, we have the defeat of the Spanish Armada. This quite intense military campaign was not something that was expected, but it was something that certainly promoted the idea of Protestant religions across not only England, but into Europe. And it also set the English naval forces as a stronghold, which was the prompting for what were the early dregs of colonialism. So we've got all of these very interconnected events that are happening, and which are all prompting a different kind of culture, a different kind of atmosphere. So if you're sitting in this space, or if you are reading something, there is not only religious strife, but there's a whole lot of political movement. There's a whole lot of force of what constitutes my identity, because all of a sudden you have travelers that are going out to new distant lands and who are experiencing other cultures and other peoples and other religions. And as a result, there's this question of what does it mean to be an English person, or to be a man, or to be a woman. All of these questions of identity are starting to come in. And more than that, they're being written about, and they are being distributed, and they are being satirized. One thing we'll talk about in the rise of pamphlets is we've actually got an increase of satirization in our writing, which hasn't really come forward before. Certain court masks are starting to make question about colonialism and the differences of identity and race. The underpill of gender with a female monarch who is not married. These are all themes that come through in the writing, and it's an incredibly rich scope that that a lot of these writers, Shakespeare included, do cover off in their pieces of literature. But one thing that we don't really see is the woman writers of this period. I love this quote from Virginia Woolf, where she says in her essay, A Room of One's Own, that if William Shakespeare had a hypothetical sister, her literary gifts would have been thwarted from the outset, thanks to restrictions on women's education in the Elizabethan age, not to mention the burdens of motherhood and domestic drudgery. Great word, drudgery. But there were still some very prevalent woman writers in England at the time. Mary Sidney Herbert, the Countess of Pembroke, was not only a literary patron, but she was a translator. Her translations of the Psalms were some of the best translations that were ever seen and were circulated within the court. She is related, as we'll see shortly, to Sir Philip Sidney, whose treatise, The Art of Poesy, was the first formulation of literary critical thinking that we have in our canon today. So you can see there's already a huge amount of influences here. Amelia Lanier is a fantastic author as well. She wrote she is the first woman to write a retelling. So forget Madeline Miller, we have Amelia Lanier. Amelia Lanier did a biblical retelling centering female voices, and she was the first one that spoke about the role of Eve in the downfall of humanity, which was fascinating. So she does have a very proto-feminist argument in her writing. One of my favorites is the woman pictured here. This is Elizabeth Carey. Elizabeth Carey is the she's the first original writer of a play in English by a woman. It was published, but it wasn't put up onto stage. The play, The Tragedy of Miriam, which was published in 1613, dramatizes the story of Miriam, a Jewish princess, explores themes of virtue, marriage, authority, and woman's obedience or defiance. This play that she wrote is what we call a parlor play. So it was never put up onto the stage, but it was distributed within households so that after dinner, you would all sit in the parlor and read the play and enact the play within the parlor. The fact that it was a parlor play in and of itself makes it an incredibly, incredibly rich work to study as a feminist literary scholar. She has the first example as well of a non-white feminine character in her play. And it is incredibly interesting to analyze her play as she does comparisons of, as we said, women's obedience or defiance, because each character has their own flaws, and it's a really, really fantastic piece of work. We also have Anne Clifford, who was born into a very wealthy aristocratic family. She was the child of the Earl of Cumberland and the Countess of Bedford. But when her father died, she actually was disinherited. And her inheritance was diverted to other male heirs. But she's chiefly known for her diaries and her memoirs. Her writing is very much domesticated. It records daily life, struggles over inheritance, reflections, and self-representations. And this is all before we have the writings of Jane Austen. All of these writers were very, very influential and were well known. But throughout the years, our knowledge of them has just declined, which is quite sad because some of these writings are incredibly rich and speak to a lot of the things that we talk about today. Beyond England, we also have some really fascinating women writers. We have Louise Labal from France, who was a poet from Lyon. She was a lyrical voice in the French Renaissance, and she challenged gender norms in love poetry. She was a big influence on Mary Sidney, funny enough. We have a Moderata Fonterre from Italy. She wrote a dialogue that explored women's roles, intellect, and social limitations. This was before even Edmund Spenser wrote his famous dialogue between Uranus and uh, Uranus and irony, I think. And in this dialogue, he talks about the politics of Ireland, but this form of uh, dialogue expression has been written before and was first recorded as a woman's writing. Then we've got the most wonderful. I just adore this portrait of Senor Juana Inez de la Cruz from New Spain or Mexico. She was a nun that spoke to women's education. She wrote a huge amount of work in defense of women's education, claiming that not only would it enhance economies, but it would protect women from what's the word I'm looking for? Would protect women from getting into situations in which they had no control over themselves, and it would help them to regulate their emotions. She was called out. She was going to be penalized and fined for her writings, and instead she went and demanded penitence as a nun, which meant she just went to go and pray over it. And then the next day she wrote a letter to a friend saying that she still believed her writings were valid, even though she did her penitence. She was a very, very interesting character, and personally I would really like to read a lot more of her writing. Beyond that, there are some contemporaries of Shakespeare that a lot of people are not aware of. These writers are just the playwrights, a handful of the playwrights that were writing plays around the same time as Shakespeare. And they are, I mean, I am a big fan of Christopher Marlowe's plays. To be honest, I feel like he is a better playwright than Shakespeare, but I know that's probably going to get me cancelled on the internet, so I won't say that out loud. Um, but Christopher Marlowe's particularly famous for his play Dr. Faustus, which I think a lot of people will be aware of here. But one of his most fantastic plays is Edward II, which explores a queer relationship between a monarch and his servant. This is the first example of queer relationships that we are seeing in literature. And even though, for example, Shakespeare might touch on these, it's never fully confirmed. Marlowe is far more advanced in his discussion of those kind of things, and particularly in Dr. Faustus, if you've read the play, he is far more apparent on his philosophy and how he thinks about things coming forward in his plays. Ben Jonson, who's the scary gentleman next to him, wrote some fabulous plays, Volpone and The Alchemist. These are satirical city comedy plays and he also wrote a couple of masks. His particular mask was the black masks that was portrayed in the court, where women actually blacken their face to perform in this mask, and it's very, very famous. It's a very famous mask that was done. But he was real sassy, Ben Jonson, I have to say. His play Volpone was probably the most malicious play I think I've ever read in my entire life. If you thought that Iago from Macbeth was malicious, you need to read Volpone, because my goodness gracious me, was that an intense, intense play. Thomas Kidd is the suave-looking gentleman next to him who wrote the first tragedy play. It's called The Spanish Tragedy, and it's one of the most important plays in the development of tragedy play within Elizabethan drama. It sets up the whole structure for tragedy. And then we've got John Webster, who wrote one of my most favorite plays, which is called The Duchess of Malfi. This presents a heroic female character at its lead, the Duchess of Malfi, who not only chooses her own husband, but defies her brothers, her authoritarian brothers, and in the process is tortured and killed. And her children are tortured in front of her. Really, really dark play, but it's a really incredible play to witness. And it was first shown at the Blackfriars Theatre, which I believe is actually still around, or at least the area of Blackfriars is still around in London. The interesting thing about Blackfriars Theatre is that unlike the Globe, it is completely indoors. So it's completely closed off. And it was burnt down a number of times because the only way that they could light it was through 1,000 candles. So often it got burnt down. But it does lend itself to a really fantastic atmospheric theatre for these kind of dark and twisted plays that we are seeing from some of Shakespeare's contemporaries. It wouldn't be a presentation by me if I didn't mention Edmund Spenser. Edmund Spenser is, these are poets and prose writers, again, only a handful that we are seeing on this presentation today. Edmund Spenser wrote his iconic epic poem, The Faerie Queene. He is known as the grandfather of poetry. His use of allegory in the poems and his Spenserian verse, which became its own kind of verse based on the Faerie Queene, was the foundation for a lot of poetry that we see in the world today. Philip Sidney, I mentioned briefly, he wrote a fantastic poem called Astrophil and Stella. You may have heard about it. It's a whole lot of sonnets that he's pulled together. And he also wrote a fantastic poem called Arcadia. But as I mentioned, there is in my opinion, his great claim to fame is his art of poesy, which he talks about the philosophy of poetry as a means for education. And it's a really, really fantastic essay that he writes. And again, formulates these whole structures of poetic literary criticism that formulate most of what we talk about today in the literary field. Another one that maybe a lot of people don't hear about is Richard Hakluyt. Couldn't find a photo of him apart from this really fantastic stained glass picture in the church of Bristol, which I didn't know, and apparently he's from Bristol, which is really exciting. He wrote compilations of travel narratives. He is known as the father of the modern geographers. He was a notable editor, translator, and encourager of geographical literature and was associated in various ways with the publication of over 25 travel narratives. His single most important work is called The Principal Navigations, Voyages, Traffics, and Discoveries of the English Nation. And as I mentioned before, these are the first travel narratives that are occurring that see the roots of colonization taking place, the English colonization taking place in America and in Africa and in India. The massive collection of voyages that Hakluyt collects and compiles were printed for the first time, and they were ranging from the 4th century to the recent exploits of Elizabethan voyagers such as Walter Raleigh, Drake, and Cavendish. Um, they were influential. They created the sense of what we were seeing in the new worlds of the world. And when we were talking about the formulation of identity, a lot of that formulation of identity was coming from the exoticism that these travel narratives were creating, that Hakluyt compiled and published. So, I mean, the big question that I always ask people, and the big question that I suppose people are asking me is, great, Cait, that's fascinating. So what? Um, well, um, I think what's really interesting about understanding this literature is that the Renaissance actually means a form of breaking away. Um, what we are seeing here is the first cultural revolution that is occurring in the English-speaking world. We are seeing the introduction of new themes and topics and discussions that are coming through that are no longer church-related. When we're looking at sort of medieval and Baroque literature, a lot of it is in relation to what the church is talking about and religious teachings. All of a sudden we have a group of people that are interacting with difference, with different cultures, with different peoples, with different countries. And we are seeing women break away from the traditional household, domestic lives that they hold, or embracing those, but finding ways of sharing their voices, which they haven't really done in the past. By looking at all of these figures and by looking at this literary landscape, we are broadening our sense of not only the period itself, but our understanding of where some of the ideas that we hold today are coming from. It is incredibly interesting to see themes of particular themes of writing that we are seeing in travel literature, for instance, still being maintained in contemporary literature of today. And those themes are being translated from those texts all the way through. What we are seeing here in this period is a formulation of what we now know as the canon of literature. We have touches of it when when we talk about the Canterbury Tales, for instance, or Beowulf or things like that. But when people talk about Shakespeare, it is generally the thought that Shakespeare is the beginning of the literary canon. But there are so many more writers that are not only talking around this period or distributing their work around this period that are influencing writing such as Jane Austen's, but who are also contributing to Shakespeare's work. Marlowe and Shakespeare were great friends, and they often collaborated on their plays together. By just narrowing our perspective, for instance, on a writer such as Shakespeare, we are not getting to see the rich tapestry that this period holds, not just within England, but within the world. From the 18th century onwards, we are seeing Shakespeare as being elevated as a universal genius. And this is completely right. I mean, Shakespeare's writing is full of character development and full of beautiful, expressive, and atmospheric writing. there is no doubt that Shakespeare is one of the literary giants of the world. But this focus on him makes him more exceptional rather than just looking at the broader ecosystem of what we're seeing in the early modern period. We've got many of Shakespeare's contemporaries' works which weren't as well looked after as some of Shakespeare's plays, for instance. We know there is a whole slew of women's writing that never made it through that we just don't have access to. Elizabeth Carey, for instance, we know she wrote a whole lot of letters and we have some of them, but we definitely don't have all of them. And that would be a fascinating, fascinating exercise to understand more of how she wrote such influential female characters. Speaking of female writers, there's also the sense of double erasure that is happening with some of the female writers in the early modern period. Not only were they marginalized in their own time, but they are often skipped over in university curricula or school curricula. For the fact, for instance, that parlor plays such as the tragedy of Miriam are just not something that people relate to these days. Unfortunately, as much as I would love to, sit and reenact a play after dinner in my living room, that is just not something that is done in modern day culture. However, you wouldn't be seen as an actor of quality if you did not perform Hamlet. Shakespeare's blend of poetic language and psychological complexity still appeals so much to a contemporary audience. However, some of the darker or dense satires that we see in Ben Jonson or in Webster seem a bit less universal. This is what critics say. I have to disagree with that. I find that by understanding these more darker plays or understanding the heartbreak that we see in the Duchess of Malfi only gives us a greater scope of understanding, not only to this period, but what we are seeing in literature today. Furthermore, these various pieces of writing, whether they are some of the contemporary playwrights, or they are the women's writings, or they are the writings from outside of Europe, we are getting a really interesting insight on alternative perspectives to politics, gender, class, empire, and religion, all from groups that have been previously marginalized and not given the space that they have deserved. And this is not just me saying this. This is something that has come through the histories of critics like Kim Hall, for instance. It also wouldn't be a lecture of mine if I did not talk about some of the books that I recommend in this space. If this is something that is interesting to you, I highly recommend checking out the books that I place on that I've put onto the screen here, and I'll talk about them all a little bit briefly. Susan Brigham's New World, Lost Worlds. This is a fantastic overview of the rule of the Tudors from 1485 to 1603. So essentially from Henry VIII through to Elizabeth I. What I really love about this book is not only understanding the new worlds of Renaissance and Reformation, but it talks about a interrelationship with some of the colonies in that were under the British rule at the time. This includes Ireland and Virginia. So I would highly recommend having a look at that if that is something that's of interest to you. Some of the other sort of similar themes. A fantastic book is Black Shooters by Miranda Kaufman. This is a fantastic, accessible read that talks through some of the limited or marginalized voices that we have seen from the Tudor period of people of color. These are actual historical figures, and Miranda Kaufman talks us through some case studies of people of color that she has found in her historical exploration. This is a really, really fantastic book, and it talks a lot to those sort of marginalized representations that we would not necessarily be aware of as we're going through this period of history. One of my absolute favorites, this isn't limited to early modern or Renaissance period. This is Eve Bites Back by Anna Baer. This talks about, for instance, the influential female writers throughout literary history. From Julian of Norwich all the way to Jane Austen, and she does have a chapter that is dedicated to the early modern period, where she talks about Amelia Lanier, and find it really, really fascinating in that. I am missing a book. Oh, it's in the shelf. Never mind. We'll get back to that. Another fantastic exploration of women's writers is Shakespeare's Sisters by Rami Targov. This is a recent released book, and it talks through four main figures, four main female figures that were writing at this time, including Mary Sidney, Amelia Lanier, Anne Clifford, and Elizabeth Cary. And a really, really fantastic exploration of those four writers and how each of them brought their writing to the surface, even when they were censored and discouraged. For the more academics out there who are interested, there are a number of books on the early modern and Renaissance period. I have in front of me, I have English literature in the 16th century. These are essays that are actually written by C.S. Lewis, which I find really fascinating because a lot of our perspectives that we have of these writers would have come from essays like this even later on in the period. But one of the most fantastic books that I have ever read on this is called The Swerve by Stephen Greenblatt. Greenblatt talks about how the Renaissance began, and it is a fantastic critical analysis and work on the ideas that circulated in the Renaissance and that we are seeing in literary themes today. If you are still interested, and I highly encourage you to be, because I still think that Shakespeare is a fantastic writer, and I am a huge fan of his plays. The best biography that I found for him is by Peter Ackroyd, and this is Shakespeare, the biography. This is thoroughly, thoroughly comprehensive and also dispels a lot of our common myths that we have about Shakespeare and his life. Um, oh, I think that's it. I breezed through that. I was thinking I was going to go over time. Does anyone have any questions? Laura, is your hand up? Sorry. Go on.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for this. This was so exciting and so interesting. And for me, I'm back in the States, so perfect way to start my Sunday. Um, so I have two questions, and you don't have to address both of them, but I figured I'd get them both out now. The first one is I've been reading a book on Christopher Marlowe, actually Stephen Greenblatt's recent book on Marlowe. And one of the things that I am struck by is the absence of information, right? The absence of records about Marlowe specifically. And so the story of Marlowe's life is being told through other people's records.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious as to what your thoughts are in doing this kind of research and this kind of investigation on these lesser known people with that kind of impediment.
Yeah.
And if you have any thoughts on that. And then my second question is, how much does the emergence of critics um, affect the positioning of these early modern writers? And is that, I don't know if there were critics at the time, like or if it's something that's more linked to the patronage system. It's like if you have a patron, then your work is known. But if you, so those were just kind of some of the thoughts that your incredible talk rose in me.
That is that is absolutely fantastic. So yes, the lack of records is a really, really big issue. Um, we have we are only, ever so often finding new pieces of information that are coming forward from historical documents. And 90% of the time, the information we have is very secondhand. It's people's letters to each other about an author or about a play um, or about a piece of work. We aren't seeing a lot of diaries, and we aren't seeing a lot of um, records at the time. Remember that this is also the time that was the Great Fire of London, so we lost a lot of information, um, possibly in that. I mean, that's just conjecture. Again, this is all just information that we are making correlations on, that we don't necessarily have a huge amount of credit to. And I think one of the reasons we have so much on Shakespeare is probably because we have the most information about him, but even that information is wholly incomplete. Um, I think this just goes to show how disparate this information is that we have on these writers, and what we have is essentially copies of their text that might not even be the original text. There's been disputes about whether the publication that we have today of the tragedy of Miriam is actually the final piece, is actually, the final publication that we have. And we don't have any of those records. It does make it really, really difficult to formulate an entire picture. But one thing and this kind of tends, I suppose, to your next question, is what is important then is to work with what we have and try and formulate the best with the information that we have at the space. And to that, I would also encourage, in that exploration, is not just looking at the text, but looking at this broader landscape. One thing I wasn't able to do in this, which I would love to end up doing, is bringing in some of the artwork that is circulating at this time. We've got a lot of portraiture, for instance. I'll actually just cycle back here, 2 seconds. we getting a lot of portraiture, for example, of Elizabeth, and of some of the royals. My best one is old Philip Sidney's hip click over here, which I just find so fabulous and sassy. Um, but we are getting a lot of this. We're getting a lot of these portraits, which, if you look at it closely, can I zoom in? For instance, yeah. We're getting a lot of this portraiture, for instance, which may have depictions of, for example, the Spanish Armada that's going on in the background here. Um, we've got defeat going on in the background over here. We've got whoopsie daisy. We've got the detail that we are seeing on her gown. All these pearls, for instance, these jewels, these silks, these heavy brocade materials, this is all coming from trade that England is having at the time. And even more so, I mean, if you look, for example, at the globe that Elizabeth is pointing to, she's pointing to, um, she's actually pointing to the side of America. You can't really see it very clearly in here, but she's pointing towards the side of America. All of a sudden, we've got this very rich portrait that is showing a whole lot of clues about what people are thinking of at the time. And if we weren't looking at that, if we weren't pulling that sort of interdisciplinary sources from from the portraiture of the time, from the literature at the time, from the historical information that we are getting at this time, we're looking at a very incomplete picture. And to that front, I would say the best thing that we can do is pull what we have from what we have, and try and formulate an idea of what might be going on at the time. I think that covers both of your questions, but now for the life of me, I can't remember if I hit both of them. Okay, fantastic. I suppose, yes, and Natasha, to your question about the female writers, and how that kind of intersects with the female authors. As I mentioned, we have very little information about, for example, Elizabeth Carey. We've got a lot more about Mary Sidney, the Countess of Pembroke, because she was a noblewoman, and because we've got a lot of information about her brother, Philip Sidney. They were all part of a very well-connected aristocratic family. Philip Sidney, well, Mary Sidney and Philip Sidney's father was stationed in Ireland as the commander of the army there. And so he interacted with Edmund Spenser, for instance, who was the governor there. You can almost see that there are connections here of a very select group of people of records that we are seeing. So we are not, for example, we are not really seeing the voices of the middle class or of the lower classes, because there was no means of providing that information. The closest we have is Emilia Lagna. She was the daughter of an Italian immigrant family coming to the UK, and she was not aristocratic. Her education was modest, but she became a voice to minor female figures in defending Eve in her work and challenging that male authority. Interestingly enough, and something we didn't really speak about, is Ladia, for instance, was the only one to publish under her own name. So we may have records of female writers which we can't attribute to them because we don't know that they wrote them. exactly. Um, Mary Sidney, for instance, never published under her own name because it was seen as very not ladylike to have your name in print at this time. Um, but we are seeing, for instance, we are seeing a lot more information coming through that is the result of not just looking at, for example, satirical pamphlets or newspaper publications or things like that. That generally was the source of what we were seeing a lot of our information from. And the reason we're seeing a lot more on these sort of more marginalized voices is that we are looking at letters, diaries, things like that that were more domesticated, were more kept by your woman of the households rather than men keeping records or producing political pamphlets. And this is opening up a lot more than we had in the past on these characters. I wish I could answer so much more, but it's a really, really fascinating and rich area that I feel like we don't get enough view on. And even to say this, this illustration that I love of Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen and Red Cross's encounter with error. This is something we are only seeing coming through in the early 19th century, for instance. So even though we have these key pieces of work, they are being reinterpreted and re-looked at and reread in particular ways throughout the canon of history and throughout the canon of literature. And that those informed views are really, really fascinating. I mean, why, if you look at this portrait or this illustration, why do we have very clear sort of mythological views here? Why do we have this very clear hybrid feminine character that is representative of so much? Yes, we see a lot of this in the poem itself, but we don't know that she's, bare-breasted, for instance, in the poem. Why is that being represented? The the use of her sort of long talon fingers, for instance, here, this is very, very linked to mythological representations of monsters that destroy children, for instance. And that is not in the poem. That is not what we are seeing in the poem. But all of this is all of these representations here are absolutely fascinating because it is going to show, it is showing the impact of this literature even in the 18th, 19th, 20th century. Oh, Joe, absolutely. I could talk about this for ages. Yes, please go ahead.
So I'm an absolute newbie with all of this. Like I bought the Eve Bites Back, and I swear that's the first thing I'm going to crack open once I'm done writing this dissertation. But so this is all new, and it is so fascinating to see the thread that you're talking about. And I would love to see more
Yeah.
of exactly what I was talking about the combination of the art with the poem, because I'm so visual. And so I really am enjoying this. This is fascinating.
I'm so thrilled. And yes, absolutely. I would love to do a comparative art literary analysis of, for example, the Fairy Queen. I mean, I am obviously a big fan of this. This is what I wrote my dissertation on, and what I will hopefully write my thesis on. So I could absolutely talk about this until the cows come home. And I'd love to do that. The interesting thing is that we are seeing such similar images. This isn't just the Fairy Queen, for instance, and I'll kind of leave this as like a snippet for maybe a next talk. But these kind of snake-like hybrid representations that we are seeing in the Fairy Queen, this is something, you know, we are seeing in Amelia Layer's retelling, or her Defense of Eve, for instance, where she talks about the snake in the Garden of Eden. This is something we are seeing in images of Medusa coming out of the time. This is something that we are seeing in The Tempest, in Shakespeare's The Tempest. These are all images that we are tracking through the canon of literature. Yeah. So this is something that is fascinating. It's almost once you become aware of these sources, of these images, it's hard not to see them being represented. I think I spoke about previously the images of, I can't even remember if I did, but I mean, even the reclaiming of the images of snakes. I mean, look at Taylor Swift's Reputation album and her use of snakes in that album and in her performance. That is coming from this. That is not coming from, that is not just something that is coming out of from nowhere. That's coming from these representations. Yeah, big time, Joe. Absolutely a portrait of fear that men have of women taking over or overcoming them. Absolutely. And this is something that is coming through the literature and coming through the myths that we are seeing from even before the ancient Greek and Roman times. This is something we are seeing in the Byzantine period, for instance. Yeah. Lauren, it is interesting that you bring up the reinterpretation by the 19th century audiences, because I've been thinking about that a lot with the Victorians' reinterpretation of plays such as King Lear. Yes, they changed the ending. I'm curious at eventually discovering if they did that with other authors as well. Thank you so much for telling us about the picture. Yes, Lauren, they absolutely did. You see the Victorians, and I will wrap up in a minute. The Victorians really try and harp back to a time where you have this sense of morality and control. And so any of these kind of disparate stories, or these disparate writers, and maybe that's actually a thing. Maybe the reason that Shakespeare came through rather than some of these other authors is because he kind of played by the rules. You know, he cloaked a lot of his subtleties, whereas Marlowe and Johnson didn't. They were very, very blatant. And maybe throughout the time, it was the fact that Shakespeare cloaked his subtleties in his plays that we are seeing them come through. But even so, as you say, King Lear's ending was changed in the Victorian era. That's fascinating. Yes, absolutely. So the conflation of serpent and fear, I could do a whole nother talk on this, by the way. And yes, if you are interested, Woman's Law is the first, is a great, great book, Woman's Law by Sarah Clegg. is a fantastic insight into starting at that. But I can absolutely do a presentation on woman and serpents if that is something that people would be interested in. Lots of nods from the crowd make me very happy. All right, everyone, that is time. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to answer them. And thank you so much for spending this time with me on Sunday. And I hope you all have a lovely, lovely day going forward. Thank you, everyone. Bye.